I just wanted to put Francis in context of Sufism. I mean, you all hear that Baba took people call him the Sufi, or he said, "I am the Sufi." Baba's own masters, two of them were actually Chishti Sufis. They were, that's Tajuddin and Sai. They actually had Chishti Sufi masters, yeah. And so it's very interesting that Inayat Khan comes into the picture, because Inayat Khan is also Chishti Sufi. And when Francis is representing like the first Chishti group in Australia, that's actually very significant, because there wasn't, at this time, there was no other, it was the first Sufism in the whole of the West. Inayat Khan coming in 1910, that was the first episode we ever had of that. And actually there was as Bernard was telling me, Celia Jen, who was a Sufi, authority. She actually came here some years ago and was actually very interested in our history, because this was the origin of Sufism in Australia, and Francis was connected with that directly. And that little group, and that's why I brought these little samples, because I just thought someone's show and tell is rather interesting to have. I mean, the Barons group even produced little books of their own, in Australia. It was, at one point, there was something like 120, 140 followers in Australia, which is pretty significant. There weren't any other, this is a little thing they put, it's a series of essays that they used. This is a thing called The Grape. They're all published in Australia. So if you ever go and look in the library, it's worth looking at. And the Baron himself, he'd spent 2 years with Inayat, although actually it seems like it was mainly he was there for the summer, had a summer camp in France, and one of these, there's a whole collection of Inayat's writings down in the library, and one of them has actually got the Ziyaq, which is the practice given directly from Inayat, and it's in the sort of forefront of this. It's just sitting there. Inayat, according to Baba, was a real saint, and I see a lot of the influences of Inayat on Francis, in the sense of the emphasis on music. There are a couple of books that Inayat did on music. He himself was a musician, quite renowned. I think that's why Francis was so keen on that. I'll just briefly talk about the. Well, there was the context of this is that when Inayat died, there was a big split between the European and the American group, and that's when the Baron came out to Australia, just after I believe it's just after the death of Inayat. Is that right? Yeah. It was 1925. Yeah. Anyway, and it's odd, because although he'd come from Europe. And that's why I thought it's actually significant that I'm sort of sitting here doing this, because all this happened in Holland, and I'm Dutch, And Inayat was based in Holland, and then I'll tell you later, the person who took over the Sufism later in Australia was Dutch, so that's rather funny. But okay, I was going to make the point that although this was the first Sufi group in Australia, so it was really quite groundbreaking. It was also sort of in some way, it was following the reject. You could say Rabia Martin, in a way, was she'd been rejected by the other lineage. That was the reason for the split. The family of Inayat decided that, well, we're the only true custodians of Inayat. And Rabia was in this odd position that on Inayat's deathbed, he'd apparently proclaimed her the successor, but nobody took that, even though there was a major Sufi figure there from Delhi who'd said he heard this. She went in 1928 to Europe, and they just said, well, we don't want you. So she ended up sort of looking after this American group. And it's odd that the Baron would be associated with that, because he'd been associated directly with Inayat, but it seems like what happened is that he had connections to America. His family had actually been back and forward there, so that for some reason he ended up being her follower. The main thing of interest here is that it was after 1943 that Rabia accepted Baba as a master. So then you had Francis living under the Baron as sort of like under Sufi traineeship, if you like, and he'd been really groomed as a successor. But there's a whole lot of things about, that wasn't fully accepted either. It's interesting that Rabia herself came to Australia in, what was that, 1937, wasn't it? Yeah. And then as you know, that Francis went to California. But the thing from Celia's thesis, you've all heard about, then a lot of the Sufis joined Francis and that was the end of Sufism. Well, actually, it was probably the reverse. It was probably about a quarter of all the Sufis joined Francis, and the rest just decided, well, they didn't know where they stood. And again, some of these books are interesting on that because, like you've got one like this one, which is the sort of biography of Inayat. It was owned by Mabel Williams, and she's written here on her death. This book is to be returned to the Sufi Society Australian representative Francis Brabazon. So he was considered that, and yet there was all this sort of toing and froing going on between him and the Baron, because the Baron couldn't accept, even though he had Ravi Martin saying, well, Baba's the one, he couldn't quite accept that. And actually, on his death in 1950. Just before that, the Baron wrote this thing, which I thought I'd read because you're probably not aware of it. The Baron left his estate to his wife, allowing for the possibility of that his wife would predecease him in some way. The Baron adds a bequest and the remainder of his estate to Brabazon, provided he, that's Brabazon, is willing to succeed me as the Australian representative of Sufism without further appointment from anyone, and neither add nor take away from anything from the teachings of Inayat Khan, and to continue to administer and promulgate these teachings in a similar manner as I did in Australia. Should Brabazon not be willing to succeed in the manner set out, the alternative distribution is specified. So, although the Baron was grooming Francis as a successor, he didn't. It was sort of all provisional on him being sort of totally devoted to Inayat, and yet at the same time he was complaining and saying, I think in 1948 the Baron actually resigned and said, because all the people are following Meher Baba, although that wasn't quite true. So you had this odd situation going on. In the end, of course, Francis was sort of in control of his little group, and I find it interesting because what he did on some of these books is he actually crossed out the reference to the groups. He'd actually crossed out the address. It said he can get further copies from somewhere, and he just put Francis Brabazon and his address. I think that'll wrap it up. The only other thing I was going to say is that just to show mementos of the Sufi era. This is this used to live in this was here, I think, when it's just after Baba was here. But it was actually used in Meher House, but it's from the Baron. And it's actually Middle East. And there's another one, the same, and they all date from like the turn of the century, and there's some sort of connection with Inayat and the early group. So just to conclude, I find that it's sort of for the Sufi society, it's an amazing chapter of history, this connection.
Excuse me, Ray. Francis inherited from the Baron, so did he accept the terms of that will?
Well, Stella actually gave him her estate when she passed on in 1953.
So he inherited from the Baron's wife, not from the Baron? I'm not quite sure on the whole...
And the Baron died before Stella.
Yeah, that's right, 3 years before Stella. Yeah.
So that paid for Beacon Hill and Avatars Abode.
I'm not from Beacon Hill, but I know it paid for here.
They paid for it.
Did it too, both, yeah. Well, he sort of... That's the weird thing about it, and there were different groups, like Stan Adams formed another group too, apparently, and I'm sure the Brufers can fill that in a lot more.
I just had to actually, Ray. One thing I've kind of often thought about is that the Baba's focus on Sufism and Francis's focus on Sufism reoriented, and that period might have been a kind of a spiritual gearing up for the immense political and social focus on Nation of Islam right now. that came later, from the 70s, I suppose. Onwards.
Oh yeah, I mean, you see it all now that Islam is in the picture. And I think there was something that I heard that Baba said about that he predicted that there would be this upheaval between Christians and Muslims to sort of bring Islam. I think Baba was about getting rid of all the exteriors, so that even the Muslims are sick of the externals, and maybe Sufism is going to be very big in the future.
With the reorientation, once Baba had that really direct kind of public influence, things like whirling, was that rejected as being too kind of ritualised religious kind of ceremony?
Whirling dervishes?
Yeah, like the...
You mean among Baba people?
Francis was a little interested in that, though, in America.
No. Well, he associated with Sufi Sam, who did a lot of Sufi dancing. Not this Sam, but he started his own group in America. See, there was a big chaos after Inayat died. It was about for 20, 30 years people couldn't make up their mind what they were doing.